is kind of retirement for Americans. It's a mandatory retirement. And you pay in with every paycheck a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. That's almost $3 trillion in the account right now. The government uses that then to make money, hopefully, but they also borrow out of that to fund other types of activities and budgets. Do you think that if the government takes money out of your paycheck and promises to pay it back to you by the time you're age 62 or 65, should that go on the government's budget or on the government's books as an asset or as a liability? It should go on as a liability, huh, George? You know how the government records it? As an asset. Yeah, the government records it as an asset because they see it as a bunch of money. So government accounting and financial accounting can sometimes differ. That's no big deal. We know what it is and we account for it. But if you added that liability to the national debt, it would just increase it by another $3 trillion. So what portion would you be willing to reduce your future income by? Well, it would have to come out of the discretionary portion of the budget. Would we be willing to cut VA benefits? Would we be willing to cut Americans' future health benefits? These are the conversations that are really going on in politics right now. Now there is the Brookings Institution, as I was actually researching for this, I'm teaching government and nonprofit finance next quarter, and I ran across this game, and I think I'm going to use it. So for those of you that are going to take that class next quarter, be looking forward to this. But if you want to really understand what all the different issues are and where you can cut and what's the effect on the economy, the Brookings Institution came up with this game that you can take called the Fiscal Ship. And that might be fun to you. If you, as I said, if you're going to take the class, you can wait and do it with me next quarter. But just something for you to take home with you as you consider about the impacts of the budget. Okay. Budget issues, complicated. Can't go very deep. Let's talk about inflation for just a second. Inflation is the general rise over time of prices, right? Our costs on tuition, our costs on food, our costs on cars, our costs on housing, our costs on oil. Everything over a period of time is going to go up slowly, slowly, slowly. Maybe not so slowly sometimes. The U.S. government regulates the strength of the U.S. economy by doing several things. They can print money, and by the law of supply and demand, if you print more money, what happens to the cost of that money? It goes down because there's more supply, right? And there's maybe constant demand, so the price goes down. Think about it this way: if the price of U.S. government debt is a function of supply and demand, then the U.S. government could print more money, drive down the rates of inflation, pay off higher debt with lower debt, and save money, reducing the size of the budget or of the national debt, just by simply typing a few numbers in to the computer and creating more money in the system. So that's one way that the government actually manages the debt, is by fluctuations in money supply, and therefore influencing inflation. Now, we have to be careful in how we do that, because if we do that too much, then there's less confidence in the U.S. economy, and so we can't always do that. They also buy and sell securities. We call that open market operations. They also manage banking policies. But Janet Yellen, the current Fed chairperson, says that the economy should, in January of this year, said that the economy should have a rate of inflation at about a constant 3% in order to remain healthy. Most good credit U.S. mortgages are right about there, or in some cases, less. So where is the money going to come from if it's going to grow? She's going to have to raise interest rates and slow down the economy. Okay. Let me mention just a couple of other things very, very quickly about inflation. Baby boomers are retiring right now, and baby boomers are at their highest rate of income in their lifetime. That's typically, as you get older, hopefully your income increases, right? Maybe not always, but hopefully. As they retire, this larger portion of the population, there's fewer of us Gen Xers behind them to replace them. And so therefore, because of that law of supply and demand, prices are going to go up. It's going to increase inflation. It's going to be more difficult to pay down that national debt because there's fewer earners now supporting a larger population of people who are not going to be producing, but now are going to be consuming that cash. Okay? So that's also another issue. Here's a third issue that I just want to briefly mention in inflation. So we talked about the budget of the U.S. as being important in the national debt. We're also talking about the inflation. There's this thing called the zero lower bound. Right now, you could say inflation is probably maybe 2% as judged by the federal funds rate or any of these other types of measures. But typically, as the U.S. economy has gone into an expansionary period and a decreasing period or recessionary period, the Fed, the Central Bank of the United States, has actually reduced the interest rates by about 5% each time to try to increase spending and put us back into a healthy growth economy. If interest rates are 2% or 3%, Janet Yellen's trying to get it up to 3% so it will continue to grow. And we go through another recession, there's no more room, right, for them to decrease interest rates by 5%. So that means that interest rates will now go into negative territory, below zero. And Canada has been this way, and there's other countries, Japan, that have negative interest rates. But in the end, the effect of that inflation is that when you go below the zero lower bound, that the government, the Fed, is putting money into these large banks. Now, you and I, we're never going to, a bank is never going to give us money to borrow money from them. But the government is going to pump money into those larger banks that then fund the economy. Where does that money come from? It comes from the productivity of U.S. taxpayers. That's where it comes from. Everything comes from the productivity of U.S. taxpayers. So, just three brief, if you will, points on inflation. Let me just mention two more things and we'll be almost done. So, there's this measure that we call the balance of payments. The balance of payments, by the way, should always be zero, and it's the sum total of all the transactions between countries. So the balance of payments consists of the balance on the capital account, or excuse me, the current account, the balance on the capital account, and the balance on the financial account. The current account is the net cash flows of trade between countries when you do exporting and importing. So if China imports more to the U.S. than the U.S. exports to China, then what the result is that U.S. dollars, cash, is going to China, right? Because we have to pay for those goods that we buy from them. But because the balance of payments calculation has to always be zero in order to balance out that current account, the difference has to either come from capital or from finance. What is finance? These are assets. These are securities. These are debts. All of that kind of thing. And so debt flows out of that account to China, as an example, giving us the two largest holders of U.S. assets and U.S. debt is Japan at $1.13 trillion. Just recently, they surpassed China at $1.12 trillion. There's a lot there, isn't there? There's a lot of information for you to absorb. The big picture of this is, though, is that to pay for those goods and services that we consume, the money has to come from somewhere. That's the big picture. Purchasing power parity, that just depends on the relative rates of inflation between two countries. The rate at which that money flows back and forth and the strength of each of those currencies to pay off those debts depends on the rates of inflation between the two countries. So, what does all this mean? Here's the number one thing. This means that Americans today are borrowing money from their children. Can we pay it back? I hope so. Or George, can we pay it back? It depends. Interest rates are going to go up. Cuts have to happen. And unless we smooth it out, the cycles of boom and busts will be bigger, and they'll be more frequently, or they'll be more frequent. What does this mean to foreign policy? The reality is that foreign policy is 1% of the overall U.S. budget. It is not a significant item in the big picture of things. However, it has huge impacts around the world and to U.S. security. I remember 25 years ago when I married my wife, she's from the Philippines. I flew to the Philippines to ask my now father-in-law, if I could marry his daughter. Right? We got in, spent several days. He asked me one day, Jeremy, why does American foreign policy, do the things that it does? I told my father-in-law to be, American foreign policy, it's not based on what's good necessarily. It's based on politics and what's expedient for the U.S. So here's some things that are benefiting the U.S. overseas and why we spend money on it. Foreign policy helps us combat drug trafficking, organized crime. It funds NATO. It funds Interpol policing agencies. It contributes to the prevention of terrorism, and it projects American power and image in other countries. That's why I think it's important that foreign policy is affected greatly by that budget. Those are some of the direct impacts that you would see in cuts. Now, here's the big question you've all been waiting for. How does all of this affect you? Right? That's what we all care about. How does it affect me? Because inflation costs of tuition will go up. They will always go up, especially for private institutions that are not funded by state and federal government. Foreign students will have an increasing difficulty paying those tuitions because of purchasing power parity and the flows of capital back and forth directly as a result of the debt that's created by these budget differences and all these things that we've talked about. Private institutions, in particular, like City University, will have a more difficult time finding foreign students because those foreign students now have to buy U.S. dollars in order to pay for that tuition and living expenses. And those institutions that cater to foreign students, particularly as a part of their institutional development, can't take advantage of those federal funds, the state funds like I mentioned a moment ago, and so they'll have less opportunities to take advantage of economies of scale. So, in the end, in order to survive and compete, my guess is that admissions will have to become more selective because they'll charge more, and the students will by nature expect more. So you want to know how all of this, these macroeconomic functions and the national debt affects you, that's it. It's going to be more costly, for sure. For sure. Hopefully, right, we can manage the economy. Hopefully we can bring that debt down. And hopefully we've got some good plans in place so that none of this happens. Right? But I hope for you, for me, for all of us, that the U.S. economy continues to be strong in the future. So thank you very much. That's what I have. I will just give you, if you're interested and want to jot down a few names, here's, to me, some interesting economists that you could look up on the internet and do a little reading. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. So if you want any more questions, you can email me. And then let's enjoy the food. Thank you.
Question, maybe. How do you think Trump's administration is going to affect all this?
The problem with Trump's administration is that it's not clearly defined. We don't have a very well-developed budget, so we don't know